All right, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research, to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. Next slide, please. Before we introduce today's presenters and the topic of their presentation, an important disclaimer for our research webinar series: this webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of Michigan Virtual and or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, and are not given nor endorsed by MVU or MVLRI unless otherwise specified. And you can move to the next slide. So today we are honored to be joined by Dr. Charles Brigham and Jered Borup. They are going to be talking about developing a survey instrument for evaluating K-12 Blended Teacher Readiness. So Charles Brigham is a professor of instructional psychology and technology at Brigham Young University, who studies technology-mediated teaching and learning with a focus on the design and evaluation of blended and online learning environments. He also researches the use of technology to enhance traditional teaching and learning. Charles has authored 50+ articles in over 24 journals and 20+ chapters related to online and blended learning in edited books, and his current research publications can be found on his Google Sites. I'm going to copy and paste that here into the chat window so you can learn more about Charles. Jered Borup is the professor in charge of the blended and online learning in schools' master's and certificate programs that are devoted to improving teacher practices in online and blended learning environments. Previous to earning his PhD at Brigham Young University, Jered taught history at a junior high school for 6 years. He has also taught online and blended courses since 2008. His current research interests include developing online learning communities and identifying support systems that adolescent learners require to be successful in online environments. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you both. Thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and we're really glad to be with you to share some of our thoughts with you today. I'm glad to be presenting with Jered, and we'll just get started here. I wanted to begin. I don't know how many of you are able to even speak online. You can use the chat space, but I wanted to begin with this question. How do you teach effectively in a blended learning environment? So what are some of the principles you might come up with or think about as you're trying to help people teach effectively in a blended learning environment? What are some of your thoughts? Looks like we've been joined by Dawn. JJ's been here for a while. We have Michelle. So what are your thoughts? How would you go about teaching someone to teach in a blended environment? Leanna, do you have some thoughts on this?
Michelle, I didn't want to dominate the conversation. I'm trying to let some other voices come through, but this is the problem when you know the presenters. Yeah, I think for me, online communication is a really essential ingredient to being able to create that blended learning environment. And so the teacher needs to know kind of how to, obviously the face-to-face teaching, and that's kind of what we're used to and what we're prepared to do, but then how does that transfer into the online setting, and how do I take that community and that presence, and how do I convey caring and still that relationship? How does that transform when I go into the online setting? So that's the communication, I think, is one of the key components when I think about effective blended learning.
Great, thank you, Leanna. And Looks like we have Michelle online talked about flexibility, and Don mentioned modeling what it looks like. These are great ideas. One of the challenges, one of the things that motivated this study for us was thinking about that question and then looking through the literature to say to ourselves, well, what does it actually look like? Like if we're going to model it, what are the skills and the competencies that teachers need to have to be able to do it well? And that's kind of what drove the question. Here in my state, in Utah, the state board that makes the rules about licensure, they created a new rule a few years ago that mandated that all teachers that are to be licensed need to have some instruction, need to have instructional time in their pre-service programs geared towards blended and fully online teaching. And so that kind of got us thinking, what do we need to do? You know, what skills should we focus on with limited time? And I think many districts have the same thing. They have limited time for professional development. How do we teach our teachers effectively to do blended in the limited time that we have? And here's a kind of a similar question, but the skills or competencies that we need to focus on in order to do this well. One of the things that we ran into as we looked across a lot of different competencies that were out there is that many of the competencies, it was difficult to tell if they were if they focused on blended. You could take the competency and apply it to a face-to-face setting just as well. So it didn't give additional guidance for how, you know, providing feedback might look in a blended setting, or the specific skills or competencies that you needed for blended. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Jered for a minute to kind of outline kind of the big picture of competencies for you.
Yeah, I have to say that when I first read that question too, I mean, how do you teach effectively in a blended learning environment? There's so many, it's such a complex question, you know, and issue. And so how do you kind of organize a response to that? And Leanna, you did a fantastic job, and, you know, Michelle and Don brought up some good points, and Catherine. But one way that we started this attempt to try to answer that is we looked at the different types of learning activities that go on. And so we categorize them in these four quadrants. In the top left, you'll see learner-human interaction. And then if you go over to the right, we have learner-content interaction, right? So the learner-human interaction, that includes any interaction with a human, the teacher or peers or parents or anything like that. And then learner content is really interacting with the learning materials. And then if you go down, you can see that it can be face-to-face, or it doesn't have to be technology or non-tech mediated, or up above, it can be mediated through technology or can be digital content. So if we go down to the next.
So I'm having a hard time here. There we go.
Oh, there you go. So when we look at traditional education competencies, it's really teachers' ability to communicate in a face-to-face environment and to facilitate student learning using non-digital content, right? So there's lots of different strategies that go into that, but that's kind of the basic. And then if you go to the next slide. When we're looking at online courses, most interaction is mediated through technology, if not all interaction is mediated through technology. And the content is largely digital, but you can also have some non-digital content, like you might be in an online English class, but you're reading Hamlet in a paper book, right? or you can do some offline activities or assessments and things like that, right?
Yeah, sometimes, for example, in a science class, they might send you out a lab kit. So you're doing a lot of your science learning, much of the learning is happening online, but they send you an actual physical kit to do labs that you're doing, that's not digital content.
Yeah, so in online courses, you have that flexibility, right? But it tends to be digital online content. So we go on to the next one. So when we also look at face-to-face courses, when we look at tech integration, what we're really seeing is that a lot of the content is still not non-digital, but then you're also integrating technology in with that. So oftentimes that's teacher use of technology to kind of present information. So like a projector or something like that, or putting things online on a class web page or something so you can access it at home. But then there's also different things like more advanced uses of technology like simulations or personalized adaptive learning software that can be more student-centered. But in tech integration, we tend to see mostly teacher use of technology. So what makes blended teaching so complex is it really covers everything. So you can see that you need to know how to communicate with students face-to-face and online. And you need to know how to facilitate student communication face-to-face and collaboration face-to-face, as well as doing the same online. And not only that, you need to know how to blend those things together, right? When does it make sense to communicate face-to-face, and when does it make sense to communicate online, or to collaborate face-to-face and collaborate online? And how can you integrate those two environments together? And the same thing with the content. There's lots of different ways to learn the material, lots of different types of materials or activities that are content-based. And so when do you do something offline and when do you do something online? And how can you blend those different types of content interactions together in a way that makes sense and that's the most beneficial for students and allows them to kind of personalize their experience? We go down to the next one. The other thing that's pretty complex about identifying blended teaching competencies is that there are lots of models of blended learning, right? So anything that is not completely face-to-face or not completely online can be categorized as blended learning. So in many classrooms, we see what we categorize as rotation models. So that can include anything from, in a classroom you have stations set up and they kind of go around, or it could be kind of a lab rotation, different things like that. So those different models require a set of skills. It can also be kind of a flex where the core instruction is coming from the online environment, which provides students with a lot of flexibility and perhaps their learning pace and perhaps their place and perhaps path. But then you also have a content expert there that's kind of using that information or the assessment data to kind of target who they're working with, when they're working with them, and things like that. So that requires its own set of competencies as well. And then on the very end, it's almost, it's really almost online, except you have some supplemental face-to-face support. So all of these require different competencies. And so if we're trying to develop an instrument that measures blended teaching readiness, we had to kind of consider all of these different ways to blend, or models of blended learning.
So one of the things that we began with as we began this research a couple of years ago with MVLRI was we began by trying to look at what the literature told us about all of the blended teaching competencies. So what we did is we tried to identify as many sources of K-12 blended teaching competencies as we could. and we coded all of those competencies. We did open coding, and then started to categorize those competencies into higher level categories. And this chart here just shows you what those were. So you can see a lot focused on pedagogy. And in the top of the pedagogy category, I think Michelle was talking about flexibility, right? Competencies around how to provide flexibility and personalization were at the top of that list. So you can kind of see what the existing competencies that are out there, what they covered. And here to the right, there's 2 articles that you could look up that have been published around this. One of the things that we found in this literature review research is what I was telling you before, that many of the competencies were generic. So this means that in terms of professional development, they didn't provide much guidance about how to specifically implement that competency in a blended context. So just a simple example of that would be, let's say you had a competency that says, teacher can provide feedback, authentic feedback to students or something like that. Well, that kind of competency, very general competency, doesn't help us know how that's done uniquely in a blended context or uniquely in an online context as opposed to in a traditional context. And so while it tells someone that you need to be able to provide feedback in a blended context, it doesn't provide enough guidance for them to know how they might do that effectively, or how it looks different from in face-to-face or fully online context. So that was one of the limitations we saw with a lot of the competencies that we hoped to address somewhat in our move forward with trying to establish a readiness instrument that helped to help teachers to know if they were specifically ready for a blended teaching context. Any comments you want to make on this one, Jered? Thoughts? Okay. So this was our first, after doing that extended literature review, working with our partner district and experts in the field, we developed a process model for the blended teaching competencies. And these are the 5 core areas that we came up with. And initially in our first round, which we presented on a year ago, we didn't have the management issue included, which we, partway through the process, kind of came to the realization through feedback and other feedback from participants and other things. We realized that the management issue is an important piece of the puzzle. And that has to do with more the classroom management, the day-to-day management. How do we manage the technology within the environment, and how do we manage the different routines in a blended environment? For example, just a simple example is, in a blended environment, you might have students moving between online digital programs and face-to-face activities. Well, how do you manage quickly and efficiently and effectively the students' ability to access those online tools? Oftentimes they have passwords, they might forget their passwords. I mean, there's a whole host of things that you have to begin to think about so that you don't lose time and you have smooth transitions in these environments. So that's the process model. Are there any questions kind of generally at this point from the participants about the categories in this process model? You can either speak out or type in the chat room. I will say that we're going to present another model, also a pedagogical model, but I was just wondering if there's any questions that you have about this.
I'll also just add, I mean, when you talk with teachers about their concerns with teaching in a blended environment, that management piece keeps coming up over and over and over. And so that's one reason why we added it as well, is it's a real big concern of administrators and teachers.
Let's see, so Michelle asked, will we be sharing the slide deck as some of the items are a little smaller? Nice to be able to reference later too. Yeah, we'd be happy to share the slide deck. Great question, Michelle. I don't know how we'll do that. Catherine, we just share it to you and then you can send it out to participants, or how?
Sure. Yeah, we can post it on the webinar page when we have the recording up as well. So we'll send those out, and I'm making note of who's here so that I can send it out to everyone. So if I don't have your email address, please feel free to share it with me.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I want to notice one other thing from this process model that is an important thing that we found out. So that the process model, it's really these last set of codes, or these last set of items that are specifically related to blended. All of the other constructs, the first order constructs, the foundations, planning, instructional methods and strategies, assessment, evaluation, management, are all kind of generic level process constructs. And ultimately, in our long-term thinking, we have changed this, or changed our thinking about this, because what it turns out is people aren't really great at thinking, teachers aren't really great at thinking about an activity as just being planning, or just being assessment, or just being, you know, methods or strategies. The specific blended competencies, we find they tend to bleed across those different high-level categories. So we'll share a little bit more about that as we go along. Let's see. Okay, I was just checking to see if there are some additional questions. Here's just some high-level, some of the articles, the research that went into each of these categories as they were developed. And I want to make the comment that developing a model like this is a design activity. So unlike other activities, maybe more scientific activities, there's not one model that exists for anything. Models are constructs that we create, and organizations that we create and then test to see if they work together. And this was a model that we created, was our first pass at a model. We had a lot of input from the literature, as well as from our participating partner organization, district, K-12 organization. Here is what the structural model looked like for our statistical testing. And I'm going to jump in here and just show you I'm going to have to back out of this a little bit. I want to show you some of the actual items in the oh, and this is not, let's see, I'm going to have to reshare. I'm just pulling up the website, and then I'm going to unshare this and share the link with you all. Share the...
I added the link.
Okay. Thank you, Jered. Usually I present not using the PowerPoint, but Google presentation, so I can just do it all in the browser. So I'm sorry about that. So here's a copy of the survey. You can see in the survey that there's these 5 areas. And then if you go down, there's for each construct, there's 5 questions. So feel free to go in. If you want, you can go in and take the survey. And at the end of the survey, once you've finished, there will be some resource. You can put your email in and it'll send you some resources related to the different constructs. So for example, if we went down to personalizing instruction, the questions under that category are using data collected online to customize students' learning experience, using data collected online to determine which groups or individual students need additional instructional support, answer students' course-related questions online, use student performance data to provide timely help with misconceptions, and address any limitations of educational software through individual or small group instruction. So feel free to go through and look at these, the questions in each of these different categories. I think that they, you know, hopefully will be interesting to you. I'm going to pop back to the presentation. Where did my, so share, come back to my presentation PowerPoint. There we go.
Okay.
Can you see it now? Can you see it back? Okay. So this was our first model, structural model that we created. Are there any questions about this? Don't see any in the chat side. I will address one question that I know we have Michael Barber with us that he raised at one point in time and gave us some feedback on. But we know that issues like personalization can be done completely in the face-to-face environment too, and that people sometimes personalize without using the technology aspects. And so we, in our model, we're focusing specifically on the, we came from a foundation of, we're assuming people are coming from a face-to-face setting, traditional face-to-face setting. So how can we create the competencies that are needed to add the online pieces to, or the technology mediated pieces to what they already have. So that's, you see that represented in the survey itself too. Jered, pass the baton to you.
So it is quite the process to develop an instrument, and Charles alluded to it, but the first step that we did is, after we created the items, we had experts in the field kind of review that, and kind of, without unmasking them, I just want to thank them publicly for all the work that they did. They really gave a lot of time and feedback on each of the items, and we're very, very grateful for that. It really helped us to refine the items and make sure that it was measuring what we wanted it to measure. So that was extremely helpful. So in round one, or phase one, we did that. And then when we added the management items, we did that again. And we had at least 4 experts review each of the items. And then we took their feedback in consideration and made revisions. The other thing that we did that was extremely helpful was there was a large school district that actually approached us because they wanted an instrument, because they were looking to kind of measure teachers' readiness. They had some blended learning initiatives going on. And so they were really invested in this as well. They wanted a measure to kind of figure out where they were and where they needed to go in this area. And so they provided us with actually lots of feedback on each of the items as well. We went through several rounds of reviews with their instructional service team, which is actually quite a large team, so we got lots of feedback from them. So then after that, what we did is we did think alouds with teachers, and for each phase, we had I think 4 teachers for each phase. We made sure that we had elementary and secondary, and we tried to vary the subject area across each phase. So again, that was really helpful just to hear their thoughts as they're reading through it. So by the end of that process, we made quite a few minor corrections and sometimes kind of bigger corrections to the items and what we're looking at. And then we were ready to administer it. So round one, again, this was everything except for the management items. That same school district that was providing us with lots of feedback ended up administering the survey to a single school pyramid. So that's the high school and all of the middle or elementary schools within that high school boundaries. And so what we found from that was that was really helpful. But then in round two, we found in round one that if the administrator wasn't really promoting it, then we weren't getting a lot of responses. And so in round two, instead of focusing on a single pyramid, we more purposefully sampled schools that were interested in moving into blended learning but weren't necessarily there yet. And that helped us a little bit to get some responses, but it was hard to get the number of responses we're hoping for, but in the end we got enough to run it. We can go down. Did you click?
Yeah, can you see the table?
No, not yet. Oh, there it goes. I think there's just a bit of a lag. So again, you see phase one and phase two. So you can see that they're pretty similar actually across. We have the total number of participants, the level that they taught, but also we asked them on the survey their teaching experience, years of teaching experience. We asked them their years of blended teaching experience and then online teaching experience. If you go down to the next one thing that I want to highlight is that it's pretty similar except for the level taught, actually. I think you went one too many. Oh. But if you look at it in phase one, most of the participating teachers were PK through 6. And then in phase two, we had more, 7 through 12 teachers. We also had a few more participants in phase two. So you see that in the orange box. And then the other thing I want to highlight is, Charles, if you can go to the next one, if you haven't already, there might be a lag there.
There's a little bit of a lag, but I just...
Yeah. So. But in their blended teaching experience in phase one, most of them had under 5 years of blended teaching experience. Of those, most had 0 years of teaching in a blended environment. That changes slightly in phase one. But again, quite a few had no experience. And then those that had experience, most of that experience was under 5 years or 5 or less years. We can go down to the next one. The other thing is that school district that I mentioned, they have recently administered the survey to all of their high school, or I don't want to say all, but most of their high school teachers. So they've collected about 2,000 more survey responses that we're in the process of getting IRB approval to use the existing data. And then that'll be added to the data we've already collected. But for now, we're just reporting on the phase two responses. Do you want to add anything to that, Charles?
No, I think that's a good, so this is really, I mean, the process of instrument development is really an ongoing process, and especially for a model as complex as this process model, which has 2 levels of constructs, as well as 13 levels of, those first order constructs, and 65 items. It's a fairly complex model. And these are the fit statistics for that model with only the 258 responses. So typically with fit statistics, with structural equation modeling, for those who are not familiar with this, there are 4 core tests that people tend to run. And each of these tests measure something slightly different on how well your data fits the model that you've created. And as you can see in this case, in phase 1 when we ran it with just without the management construct and its subconstructs, all 4 areas had good fit. When we added the management construct with the 258, we only 2 of the 4 actually have good fit across for the fit statistics, which our measurement expert helped us understand that that's pretty good considering the number of responses that we have. And we expect and are anticipating with the 2,000 responses that we'll see much better numbers here because we feel pretty confident about our about the model. After we ran the whole thing as a model, because 2 of them didn't, 2 of the fit statistics didn't work out, we ran each of the factors separately. And as you can see, when we run them this way to see if the individual how well the individual factors work statistically, the individual factors all worked out well except for assessment and management had 1 fit statistic that did not work. Close, but not work. So this also leads us to believe that the lack of fit is not due to the quality of the survey, but is due to the small numbers in relation to the complexity of the survey. So that's something that we'll be able to test out and report on in the next little while, hopefully, if we can get access to that further data. Are there any questions about this so far? Okay, so what I want to share with you now is kind of our future thinking. Or we started thinking about this actually in phase 1 and started doing some development. But one of the challenges with the larger model, even though things are working out statistically for it, is that it's quite large. There's 65 items, so it's takes a little bit longer for people to take. It's a process model. So for example, you might see elements of personalization that span across planning, implementation, assessment, all of those things. So it makes it a little bit harder for a teacher who might be thinking kind of more holistically about their roles to have each one of those things not correlate with each other.
Charles, can I add something too?
Yeah.
So just this week, we had a teacher email us that was taking the survey, the longer survey, and he said, once I got to 3.1, which is after about 30 items, which isn't even halfway through, he said, I was so tired of taking the survey, And so we knew that it was long. And it's a big ask for a teacher to kind of really focus in on that many survey items, especially when many of them are trying to measure, a single construct. And so they are similar by design. And so there is survey fatigue in that longer instrument. And so we're hoping that with this instrument, that would be easier and more practical to use with teachers and even use it as a repeated measure with teachers.
Yeah, thank you, Jered. And so part of what we've done, so we've tried to make this a little more practical so that it could be used with teachers and professional development in a slightly different way. So this is our second model that we're working on. We've gone through the same process that Jered talked about with the other model. We were doing it simultaneously. The main difference is we haven't administered this one yet, so we haven't collected data on this one yet. That's next phase in the process, but we're feeling pretty good about it right now. So this, what we tried to do is we tried to identify core ideas or core competencies from the process model that stood out and that are kind of unique, or not unique, but particularly important in a blended environment. And so these are the 5 categories that we have, and here's a description of them. So online integration is the ability to effectively combine the online instruction with the in-person instruction. The real-time data practices, the ability to use digital tools to monitor student activity and performance in order to guide student growth. The personalizing of instruction is the ability to implement a learning environment that allows for student customization of their goals, pace, and or learning path. And then the online interaction is the ability to facilitate interactions online with the teacher and between students. And here's the more simplified model. And I'd invite you, I'm not going to pull out and go to this one right now because of the pain it was to do that before, but you can go to this bit.ly and look at it yourself. Right now, in each of those 5 areas, we have 8 to 10 construct, or 8 to 10 items, with the idea that when we do the testing, we may be able to pull out some items and use fewer number of items, the ones that are the strongest items for the competency. So maybe Jered, can you post that link in the chat space? And then I wanted to say, I think, well, first of all, I think, Jered, I did some of your slides. I'm sorry that I just,
No, you
we
didn't.
decided ahead, and I think I just jumped on some of his.
It's Friday, Charles. I'm totally okay with this.
We are, part of our reason for taking on this project is we're committed to providing kind of scientifically validated resources, instrument and resources to people for free. We want to create resources that people can use without having to pay a large fee to an organization, because we've both experienced this as we teach pre-service teachers, where you have limited funds. But so this is a service that we're providing. So we're creating these readiness instruments. We've also been involved in creating some open educational resources related to that. So you can see the cover of the book we have here. We're hoping that it will be available soon, as in available to the public in January. Right now we're doing the final kind of review of the book. If any of you are interested in being reviewers, and looking at some of the chapters and providing some of your expertise and feedback, would welcome that. Just send us an email. But this book focuses on these skills, these four competencies: online integration, data practices, personalization, and online interaction. If there's something else you'd like to say about that, Jered, or Leanna, you could even chime in now if you wanted to say something, because you've been involved as a contributor to this book.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, when we talked with the school district, how they needed a measure, but they're like everyone else. It's one thing to know where you are, but it's another thing to know how to get to where you want to be, and there's some great resources, but school districts are strapped. And so we're really happy to be able to create this book and hope that it's helpful for those, in a very, very low cost solution or free solution for school districts and others.
Yeah, I'll just add that I'm very glad to be part of this work, and I hope more researchers are starting to look at not just the implications for our own research agenda, but then how do we take what we're learning and apply it to practice and make resources available through Creative Commons so that practitioners can have access to them.
Are there any questions? Let's see, I see one from Michelle or Jered. Oh, Jered's been answering some of the questions in the chat space, so thank you, Jered.
Although I don't know, Michelle, did we answer your question?
Well, I'm not sure how good my audio is here, so I was just curious, in looking at your sample sizes, you had about 200, and you said you were looking forward to looking at the measurements with the larger audience. So my question was, if we are working with small rural school districts that maybe they have 25 teachers in their whole K-12 school district, and they maybe are going fully blended, is there still value in this tool for that smaller group?
Oh, absolutely. So I think we're talking about two different things here. So the validation process really only has to be done initially, right? And that validation process requires us to gather a large number, have a large number of respondents so that we can, with confidence, say, this instrument is measuring what we think it's measuring. Once we've gone through that validation process, you could use the instrument with 3 people or 1 person. You just have confidence that it's been tested with a group of in-service or pre-service teachers, so you can have confidence in that the test is a valid test. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
And
yes.
Charles referenced this as well. So at the end of the survey, we provide a score and some resources. So I mean, it could even be used as a self-reflection tool for teachers on their own, right? To kind of measure where they're at. And you could see a school district, even a small school district, customizing what those resources are or recommendations are to teachers, or trying to encourage them to enroll in professional development opportunities in the district or elsewhere. So there's lots of ways that you could use a tool like this, even in a small district.
Yeah. Let me just say one other thing. I really appreciate your question, because I know that not everyone are researchers, and not everyone have strong quantitative background in research. And my strength is not necessarily the quantitative. We have I do quantitative research, but we have experts, measurement experts, that are helping us with this. And basically the items, we have a lot of confidence in the items that we've created. But what the measurement does, it says, when we group these 5 items together, or these 8 items together, are they really more alike than they are different? So that when someone scores high on all 8 of these things, we can say they have high competency in personalization, right? Because all of those things are really getting at personalization. And it's not that 3 of them are getting at personalization, but 4 of them really are getting at something else that we don't know what that is. So that's kind of what the validation process is doing, is it's going to help us say with greater confidence that the items that we've created are measuring these higher level constructs that we are saying that they're measuring. So I think any other comments, Jered? We're open to questions. We can stick around for a few minutes and answer personal questions that you have, maybe once the recording stopped, if you have questions.
Related to this instrument.
Yeah.
Right.
Not personal questions, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, Charles, if and Jered, and I think you touched on this a little bit, are you seeing this more as a diagnostic tool, as a tool to kind of hone in on needs areas for professional development? It brings up, just reminds me kind of the S-free model for student readiness for online learning, and I'm wondering if there might be some language around if you score low, you know, what does that suggest? Should a teacher not blend, for example? And what, you know, kind of how you're envisioning this schools making decisions based on the administration of your survey.
Yeah, that's a great question. And when I meet with some school administrators, sometimes they see it as teachers' readiness, right? But it's really their perceived readiness. And we're really measuring perceptions, not actual ability. Emily Pullman, who was on this research project as well, was on her dissertation. She was trying to develop an actual assessment to measure that, but didn't find good fit. But that's something that I feel like as a field would be really helpful to actually get at their actual skill level. But I think with an instrument like this, I wouldn't recommend it be high stakes for making decisions. I think it's one bit of information, but school districts also need to take a broader view of a teacher's ability and readiness.
And I think I agree with everything that Jered said. I think there's a couple of ways that I envision this being most useful. You know, at a personal level, you know, teachers have, you know, they're incredibly busy people, and districts are busy. They have limited professional development resources. So how can we maximize the use of those professional development resources? Well, one of the ways that can happen is if we understand where people have greater strengths or have greater strengths in the competencies and less strengths in the competencies, we can focus our professional development on the areas that they need most help in. Or as a teacher, if I'm doing this kind of as an individual practice, I might say to myself, I'm going to take this, I see where I need the most help. You know, I see, oh, wow, the personalization area is an area that I really need a lot of help in, and I can focus my initial self-professional development efforts, my investigations about what that means and how to do it better, I can focus in on that. So it provides maybe some guidance and some scaffolding in terms of where people can start. Another way of a district thinking about it, they could administer this to different schools, and they might be trying to decide, you know, we can't start all of our schools at once with, you know, maybe a one-on-one program or something like that. So where might we start where we're going to be able to, where our faculty are most ready to get started right now in the process. So there's different ways that I think it could be very useful, but just reinforce again, like with Jered, that it's a self-perception instrument, it's not measuring actual skill. In the blended teaching book, we've actually created a set of badges which have more of the authentic tasks where teachers could actually do some of the tasks required to blend and use those as evidence for a more competency-based assessment. Any other questions? That was great, Leanna.
Sorry, I just saw Michael's question.
Oh, I didn't see that.
What's the meaning of life?
Might not have enough time for that discussion.
Happiness, joy, family. Blended learning kind of ranks pretty low on that list, but.
Excellent. Well, If there are no other questions, we can go ahead and wrap up. Feel free to stay with us, though, if you do have additional questions. I'll be sending out the slide deck and the link to the report after we finish up here. Thanks so much for sharing your email addresses for that. And a huge thank you to our presenters, Charles and Jered, and for your co-authors for sharing your work with us today. And thank you all for joining us. Our next webinar will be on Wednesday, September 26th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Jered will be back along with Dr. Chawana Chambers and Rebecca Stimson from our team here at MBLRI to talk about their work with students to understand their perspectives on teachers and mentors as online learning supports. If you are interested in keeping up with the latest webinars, please email us at mblri@mivu.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and/or LinkedIn. We hope you enjoy your weekend. Thanks so much again.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.